If any of you know something about video gaming in the Soviet Union in the 80s and Russia in the 90s, you probably think that we mostly played homemade ZX Spectrum clones of all kinds, and then Dendy, the Taiwanese Famiclone imported here by Steepler in 1992. Those who watched the Russian video game Comrades show can also remember I told about Soviet Nintendo's Game & Watch clones made by Electronica, and that we had some other computers, both Soviet-made like Agat and imported like Yamaha's MSX2 computers that were used in some schools in the USSR. Thing is, all of these weren't the only video game devices neither in the Union nor in Russia. We also had arcade machines, some of which were also clones of famous Western games, and some were real original Russian video game products. The second ones were already mostly made in the 90s, but this is a story for another time.
And believe it or not, Soviet Union also had the real video game consoles.
And I'm not talking about Dendy or any other Famiclones now. I'm talking about Soviet gaming consoles. They weren't as popular or mass-produced here as your Western ones in the 70s and the 80s, and also they were quite outdated on their Soviet release date. But the fact Soviet citizens could have video games back then sounds a bit unreal, right? So today, I decided to tell you what type of the video games they could play in the USSR back then, and how expensive this kind of entertainment was for an ordinary Soviet person.
Hello YouTube, my name is Victor, and you're watching the Russian Video Game Comrade show.
Let's start with the Electronica handheld games, but not with the ordinary ones you already know about. Besides Soviet versions of Mickey Mouse, Octopus and other Game & Watch clones, Scientific and Production Association Electronica released a couple more electronic games. And if you're into handheld consoles from the 80s, you'll probably find them somewhat familiar. For example, Electronica IM-12. It was designed as a successor of the most famous Nu Pogodi game, where the wolf from the Soviet cartoon took the place of Mickey Mouse catching eggs. Now the protagonist was Winnie the Pooh, and not the Disney's one you know, the Soviet one.
Piglet!
What?
Do you have a shotgun at home?
Yeah?
Bring it over as soon as you can!
The most fascinating thing about all the Soviet tech for me is the fact they provided all the schematics of the devices either with the device or in the science magazines. And this is not a joke. You bought a TV, you got its schematics with it. You wanted a computer, you could buy a magazine and build your own, if you could get the components. Not the IBM PC of course, but a ZX Spectrum clone, yes. You were interested in how the CPU of the Electronica IM-12 works. You could get a Microprocessor Tools and Systems magazine issue number 3 from 1988 and read an article about it. An article written by the guys who made Electronica IM-12. This handheld was even intended to have the replaceable game cartridges. But as it happened with a lot of Soviet tech, the manufacturer couldn't produce enough units to make them affordable and popular, and it ended up only with one game cartridge, Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh had to avoid obstacles and bees, collect items and eventually get to the right part of the screen. If we speak gameplay, it stayed pretty basic. But if we take a look at the appearance of the game, we can instantly see a lot of enhancements in it. The most obvious is a color display. Technically it's still black and white by the way. The color is achieved here with a clever mirror and filters approach. Unfortunately, there is still no backlight in the handheld, so to play it, you have to have a bright external light source. Overall, Winnie the Pooh is quite next-gen compared to classic Game & Watch games, and we could consider it a nice Soviet invention. But
the only Soviet invention is implementing Winnie the Pooh in it. Otherwise, it's also a clone.
A clone of Nintendo's CJ93 Donkey Kong Jr. Even the game screen layout is the same. It appears Soviet engineers made Mario 16-like games before it became mainstream. Another Soviet handheld, Electronica IM-26, eventually got the replaceable game cartridges. The games weren't as next-gen as Winnie the Pooh though, they were just ordinary games you could play on separate Soviet Game & Watch clones. Nu Pogodi, football, car race, and etc. It seems someone of the Electronica employers saw Bandai's Digicast and told his boss, "Hey, Boris, remember we wanted to make a game with the changeable games in it? Did you see that?"
And Boris went like,
That's a great plan, Walter. That's fucking ingenious, if I understand it correctly. It's a Swiss fucking watch.
Yes, IM-26 is a clone of Japanese Digicast from 1984. And yes, it also had several games on separate cartridges. To be honest, I don't really understand the profit of making such cartridges. All the game is in a cartridge, and the lower part you plug the cartridge in is basically just a gamepad. It seems that the cartridge part is much more expensive. So what was the profit of selling it as a part of some device? The only thing I can think of is that it costs a couple bucks cheaper compared to the competitors. And as you already had a compatible gamepad, you could stick to buying a cartridge instead of a whole new game. But still, I'm not sure it benefited Bandai much. Speaking of Electronica's version, it was even more confusing as all the 5 compatible games were bundled with the handheld itself. It seems Soviet engineers learned to copy stuff extremely well, but apparently they could not appreciate the essence of the original business idea in a society striving for communism. The last but not least handheld for today is Electronica IR01. For us here, it looks more like an alco tester nowadays than like a game. But you guys in the West most likely know what it is, as Electronica IR01 is a clone of your first handheld from 1976, Electronics Auto Race by Mattel. Electronica IR01 was also the first electronic game released in the USSR, but its release was delayed 7 years from all the other world. It hit the Soviet stores only in 1983. On the screen with a resolution of 3 by 9 pixels, there is a track, your car, and obstacles that appear during the race. The goal is to score 100 points and not crash. The Chinese will later implement something similar at theirs, a lot of in-one brick games that were very popular in the 90s Russia. The price in the USSR for this game was 25 rubles. For comparison, in 1983, 1 ruble in the Union could buy a dozen eggs, 4.5 pounds of fish, or 22 pounds of potatoes.
the ones shown above are of course not the only electronic games released in the USSR.
All sorts of air battles, coast guards, electronic tabletop football games and so on were presented in quite a large number on the market. But in my opinion, these are still not video games, and certainly not consoles in the modern sense of definition. These are exactly what electronic games are, or let's say portable arcade machines. And we'll have a dedicated episode on these ones on the Russian Video Game Comrade show later.
And today's theme is video games consoles. And now it's time to move from the portable ones to the ones that hooks to your TV. Yes, we had this in the USSR too.
These ones were much pricey, 100 to 150 rubles, and 150 was the average salary in the USSR in the 80s. Was it too much to ask for some game? It depends. If we compare that price to the price of modern video game consoles considering nowadays salaries in Russia, it seems that nothing has changed. For instance, a PS5 or Xbox Series costs in Russia around 60 to 70,000 rubles. And it's the average salary of an ordinary person in Russia now. In the far regions of Siberia, for example, the salary can even get twice lower, 30 to 40,000 rubles. And it's only the price for the console itself. And today you also have to buy games for it. Back then, all the games were already built in.
So maybe those consoles were even cheaper than the modern ones we got now.
Naturally, 99% of all these consoles were the most ordinary clones of Atari Pong, and differed only in manufacturer and appearance. From the very first, in the USSR, Palestra 02 to Videosport M, only the appearance and color of the body changed. In all other respects, it was a standard Atari variation of Pong, which only took 6 years to reach the Soviet player. Palestra 02 began to be produced already in 1978. Let's not forget that, for instance, Dendy console got here only in 1992, while in Japan the Famicom was available since 1983.
So Pong arrived in the USSR even faster than the Famicom to Russia.
The latest models, Videosport 3 and Videosport M, have added a pistol and, accordingly, several games for it. Also completely monotonous, but I'm sure that in 1985, even this difference was extremely interesting. Simply because it added something new to the home entertainment. In the arcades, people played all sorts of hunting and sniper games, and now this could be done at home. Admittedly, using a little more imagination, but let's be honest, the Soviet arcade shooting galleries of the 80s were also quite primitive, so imagination in the Union in the 80s was a fairly useful skill in any field of entertainment. There were dozens of Pong consoles here. More varied were only ZX Spectrum clones, but they started to appear a little later. But the most interesting thing here, in my opinion, is not even this, but the fact that variations of Pong consoles were produced in the USSR not only in the form of home consoles.
The other form can be nothing out of ordinary for you guys, but here in the USSR, this was the thing no one of us could even dream of.
I'm speaking about the consoles bundled with the TV sets themselves. Japan and Korea had a lot of these in the 90s bundled with Famicoms and Super Famicoms. But here in the USSR we could have it already in 1981. But obviously with Pong, not the Famicom. I've told that it may be nothing out of ordinary for you guys, as I know you had these even earlier. For instance, Magnavox released a Pong TV already in 1976. But in the USSR in 1981, it was somewhat like a miracle.
And quite a pricey one.
Yes, the Rubin TV set C1205 bundled with Pong was only 75 rubles more expensive than the same one C205 without Pong. The standalone console cost 150. But the price for a color TV in 1981 was around 800 rubles. Remember the 150 salary? So a lot of Soviet citizens not familiar with video games at all didn't understand back in the day why they had to pay half a salary more for something they didn't understand. This has led to the fact that even photographs of a model with Pong are now very difficult to find on the internet. I'm not talking about videos. There are none. But this model existed and some happy kids had it. The Rubin company continued to bundle video games with their TV sets till the 2000s. There were not only Pong, but also some other simple logic games later. The one named Clickomania is still remembered by many owners of TVs of this brand. If fast forward a little later, there were also some original Soviet consoles in the 90s Russia. Technically, these were already released, not in the USSR, as the USSR ended in 1991. But both of the consoles I'm gonna tell about now started to develop in the end of the 80s or in the early 90s by Soviet engineers, so I think they can also be considered Soviet consoles.
The first one is ALF. It was released in Belarus in 1993.
It was made in Brest City by the government-owned factory Zvetotron. And believe it or not, it was a real video game console, based on the ZX Spectrum PC. This has some Amiga CD32 vibes, hasn't it? As it was a video game console, it had not a keyboard but gamepads, not tape recorder or floppy disk as a storage device, but a cartridge, and it could be connected to an ordinary home TV with a RCA cable. The games you'll see on it are the ones you expect to see there. The Russian version of the famous ZX Spectrum games. A dozen of them were modified to be played on the ALF and put into several multi-carts compatible with the console. Several hundred of the ALF consoles were released and spread over all the former Soviet countries. The console is quite rare now, but not impossible to find. Even more, there is an enthusiast community around the console, and they not only port new games to it and make flash cartridges, but even replicate the console itself using modern components. It's an open source project and its author Prusak posted every schematics, dumped software, etc. on his site zexbyte.ru.
A real Soviet engineer in all the best sense of the word.
Maybe someday I'll make a dedicated video on this console. I really want to assemble one and try the HDMI version of it myself. The weirder the more interesting. Unfortunately, despite the great idea and a decent realization, ALF was too late to become successful on the Russian video games market. In 1993, it was already ruled by Steepler and its Dendy. And don't get me wrong, I like Specky's games a lot. But technically, they are no match for the NES's ones. Nothing surprising, Alf didn't succeed. It just couldn't compete with Dendy. If only the Alf team released it several years earlier, let's say in 1988 or 1989, it could really become a hit here, and we could expect some Russian Super Alf later. But unfortunately, history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood. So Alf, just like the Soviet Union, was done and is a history now.
But Alf wasn't the only one original post-Soviet console. There was one more.
Or there could be, to be precise, as the Krokha console intended to be released by the Soviet software company Kontur in the 1990s was produced in only 200 PCs and never went to any store. All the prototypes were distributed among the company employees, and this time I don't really understand why the company decided not to release their console, as for 1990 there weren't any decent video game consoles on the Soviet market, and they really had a chance to make the first one. I don't own a console myself, but my fellow YouTuber Dmitry Nubilius has one. He disassembled it and figured that this console, just like the Belarusian Alf, was based on a computer, but not on a ZX Spectrum. It was based on the Soviet computer Specialist. Specialist was a Soviet computer developed by Anatoly Volkov in 1985. It was a 2 emirs PC with 48K RAM and 384 by 256 resolution video adapter, compatible with both text and graphics modes. Remember, I told you that all the Soviet tech had all the schematics with it, and you could even build your own PC with a magazine article? Well, this was the same kind of a PC. All the schematics of it were published in a Modeler Constructor magazine in 1987. And as I understand, guys from Kontur used this exact magazine to design their video game console. The computer schematics was reworked to make it even more cheap and simple. Both the tape recorder and graphics mode was excluded from it, and the console ended up only playing simple games from cartridges. But for the 1990 in the USSR, it was a great entertainment machine. I personally would be glad to play it back then if I had an opportunity to. Comparing to the Atari 2600 clone Rambo some of us had in the early 90s, these were decent games, and once again, the commercial success could expand Krokha to a pro model with graphics mode, and one could lead to another.
But once again, it never did.
There were much more custom computers in the USSR than consoles. In the society where the main goal of every citizen was to learn and make their country great altogether, this seems legit. Why make some childish consoles when you can make a computer you can work with instead? And if your kid needs some games, you can just run them on the computer, right? But as in every rule, there is an exception, and some bright minds really saw an opportunity in the entertainment sector as well. Unfortunately, not a single one of them succeeded. I'm not the one to judge what's wrong and what's right here, but I'm really glad that we at least have a chance to take a look at the things that barely existed back then today. And even more, I'm really glad that I can share these things with you guys, and I hope they are as interesting for you as they are for me. I'm trying to make more videos for the Russian Video Game Comrade show now, guys. If you like the show and want to see new episodes more often, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Let's make it this way. If we achieve only a $101 monthly patronage, I'll promise to release a new episode every month. How does it sound? The link to the Patreon page and to the other social networks are in the description. If you like weird Soviet and Russian stuff, follow me on Twitter. I post it a lot there. Well, I think that's it for today.
Thank you for watching today's episode. I really hope you liked it. Please press thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Have a nice day, good luck!